You seeing this? Is this part of some new performance art? Hey, you lost, sweetheart.
The restaurant was already full when the girl stepped inside, and the first thing she noticed was the smell. Butter, garlic, roasted meat rich, heavy scents that wrapped around her body like something cruel and intimate, something she hadn't felt in days. Her stomach reacted instantly, tightening, growling low and sharp, as if angry at her for bringing it somewhere it knew it didn't belong. She paused just inside the doorway, fingers curling around the strap of her worn backpack, the fabric thin from years of use, the zipper missing 2 teeth. For a brief moment, she considered turning around and leaving, pretending she had never been brave enough to open the door in the first place. But hunger has a way of pushing people forward, when pride would rather pull them back. Her name was Nia, 17 years old, too thin, too quiet, the kind of girl teachers described as polite but forgettable, the kind of girl the world trained itself not to see. Her sneakers were scuffed at the toes, her jeans faded and frayed at the hems, her jacket 2 sizes too small for the winter air that still clung to the city in early spring. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, half a piece of toast she'd split with her little brother before sending him off to school with a smile she practiced in the mirror every day. The hostess glanced at her, eyes flicking down and back up in less than a second. It was enough. Nia felt it. That silent calculation, that judgment. She swallowed and forced herself to speak. "Hi," she said softly. "I was wondering if you were still hiring. I saw the sign outside." The hostess hesitated, then gestured vaguely toward the dining room. "You can wait there." Nia nodded, relief washing over her in a weak, trembling wave. She stepped forward, past tables draped in white linen, past men in tailored suits, and women with glossy hair and diamond earrings that caught the light. Forks clinked against plates, wine glasses chimed. Laughter rose and fell in smooth, careless rhythms. It all felt unreal, like she had wandered into someone else's life by mistake. That was when he noticed her. The man sat at the center table, as if the room had been designed around him. Everything about him spoke of money, his tailored charcoal suit, the heavy gold watch on his wrist, the way he leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who had never been told no and actually believed he never would be. His name was Julian Cross, owner of the restaurant, investor, philanthropist, according to the plaques near the entrance, a man who donated to charities and made sure the cameras were always there when he did. Julian was in the middle of telling a story, something about a deal that had gone his way, when his eyes drifted toward the entrance. He stopped mid-sentence. His gaze lingered on Nia, taking her in piece by piece, and slowly a smile spread across his face. Not a kind one, not even a curious one. It was the smile of someone who had just spotted something amusing. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You seeing this?" he said to the men beside him, his voice loud enough to carry. "Is this part of some new performance art?" One of them chuckled. Another followed. Nia froze, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. She looked around, unsure, hoping stupidly that he wasn't talking about her. But when Julian stood, straightening his jacket, she knew. "Hey," he called out, his tone mock-friendly. "You lost, sweetheart?" The room seemed to shrink. Conversations quieted, eyes turned. Heat rushed to Nia's face, her ears ringing as if she were underwater. She shook her head slightly. I'm here about the job," she said. Her voice barely made it past her throat. Julian laughed. Not a chuckle, not a polite exhale, a full barking laugh that cut through the air like a blade. "A job?" he repeated. "Here?" He walked closer, slow and deliberate, circling her the way someone might inspect a questionable purchase. "Do you know where you are?" he asked. "This isn't a fast food joint. This is a fine dining establishment." "I know," Nia said quickly. "I can work hard. I learned fast. I just need—" "Need what?" Julian interrupted. "Money? Food?" He glanced pointedly at her stomach. "You look like you could use both." A ripple of uneasy laughter spread through the room. Someone coughed. Someone else stared at their plate a little too intently. Nia's hands shook at her sides. She hated that part the most, the way her body betrayed her fear, no matter how hard she tried to stand still. "I just need a chance," she said. Julian tilted his head, pretending to consider it. Then he snapped his fingers at a passing waiter. "Bring me a plate," he said. "Anything, doesn't matter." The waiter hesitated. "Sir, now?" Julian said, his smile sharp. Moments later, a small plate appeared. Bread, thick, warm slices, still steaming slightly. The smell hit Nia harder than anything else had. Her mouth filled with saliva. Before she could stop it, Julian picked up one slice, examined it, then broke it cleanly in half. "There," he said, holding it out. "That should hold you over." For a second, Nia didn't move. The room was completely silent now. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do. Her pride screamed at her to turn away, to leave, to let herself starve before accepting this kind of humiliation. But her stomach clenched violently, and her thoughts went to her brother, to the way he'd ask her that morning if dinner would be real food tonight. Slowly, she reached out and took the bread. Julian's smile widened. "Careful," he said. "Don't want to spoil your appetite." A few people laughed again, louder this time, relieved by the release of tension. Julian turned back toward his table, satisfied, already dismissing her from his mind. "All right," he said, clapping his hands once. "Show's over." Nia stood there for a moment longer, the half slice of bread heavy in her hand, her vision blurring. She felt small, smaller than she ever had before. And then, without a word, she turned and walked out. Julian sat back down, picking up his wine as if nothing had happened. He didn't notice the way a few diners avoided his gaze. He didn't notice the hostess wiping her eyes behind the counter. And he certainly didn't notice the way Nia stopped just outside the restaurant, pressed her back against the cold glass, and let herself slide down to the pavement, clutching the bread like it was the most valuable thing she owned. What Julian didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that the moment he laughed at her, something ancient and dangerous had shifted. Because Nia hadn't come there by accident, and she wasn't as powerless as she looked. By this time tomorrow, the world he ruled so effortlessly would be cracking at its foundation, and it would start with her. The night swallowed Nia whole as she walked away from the restaurant. The city lights blurring through the tears she refused to wipe away, until she turned the corner and knew no one could see her anymore. The half slice of bread was still in her hand, now cold, its warmth gone almost as quickly as the dignity she'd tried to hold onto inside those walls. She didn't eat it right away. Instead, she stood there under a flickering street lamp, staring at it as if it were evidence of something, proof of how small the world thought she was allowed to be. Her stomach twisted again, sharper this time, and she finally took a bite, chewing slowly, deliberately, forcing herself not to cry as the dry bread scraped against her throat. It tasted like survival. It tasted like humiliation. She didn't go straight home. She couldn't. The apartment was too quiet at night, too full of thoughts that crept in when there was nothing to distract her. Instead, she walked. Past shuttered storefronts, past bus stops where people waited with tired eyes and plastic bags full of their lives, past a man sleeping on cardboard under a bridge, his face half covered by a newspaper. Each step felt heavy, but beneath the weight, something else was forming, something sharper, harder. Anger, yes, but also clarity. By the time she reached the small apartment she shared with her brother, Malik, the sky was already dark. The hallway smelled like bleach and old carpet. She unlocked the door quietly, slipping inside and closing it behind her with care. Malik was asleep on the couch, curled into himself, his school books stacked neatly on the floor beside him. He'd been trying to do his homework without her, she knew. Trying to help, the thought made her chest ache. She placed the remaining piece of bread on the counter, then covered Malik with the thin blanket they shared. As she watched him sleep, his brow furrowed even in rest. Something inside her finally broke, but it didn't break into tears. It broke into resolve. She wasn't going to let this be their story, not his, not hers. Later that night, long after Malik's breathing had evened out and the city noise faded into a distant hum, Nia sat at the small kitchen table with her mother's old laptop open in front of her. The thing was slow, the fan whining loudly every time she tried to open more than one window, but it worked. It had to. She typed carefully, fingers moving with purpose, searching through files she hadn't touched in years, documents, emails. Scans of paperwork she'd never understood before, but had refused to delete because something deep inside her told her they mattered. Her mother, Alana, had been careful, brilliant, methodical. Before she died, she taught Nia two things that never left her. Never underestimate people who smile too easily, and always keep copies. Nia remembered that now, scrolling through old folders, labeled in plain, unassuming ways, taxes, contracts, correspondence, and then she found it. The name on the screen made her breath catch. Julian Cross. At first, she thought it had to be a coincidence. A common name, maybe, but as she opened the file and read, the pieces began to align with a slow, terrifying precision. Emails between Julian and her mother, financial projections, early investment plans for what would eventually become the restaurant she'd just been humiliated in. Her mother's signature was there, clear as day, on documents outlining ownership percentages, profit sharing, silent partnership terms. Nia leaned back in her chair, heart pounding so loudly she was afraid it would wake Malik. Her mother hadn't just helped Julian get started. She hadn't just advised him, she had funded him. Half of it, half of everything. The room felt suddenly too small. Nia stood and paced, her thoughts racing. Her mother had been a financial analyst before she got sick, sharp and relentless, the kind of woman people underestimated until it was far too late. Julian's emails to her had been different back then. Respectful, almost deferential. He'd needed her. And somewhere along the way, after the restaurant took off, after the money started flowing, he'd cut her out. Nia's hands curled into fists. It wasn't just cruelty. It wasn't just arrogance. It was theft. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she read. She pieced together timelines, traced money, cross-referenced dates. She understood enough, more than enough, to know what this meant. And she understood something else too, something that made her lips curve into a small, humorless smile. Julian Cross had no idea who she was. The next morning, Julian woke up feeling excellent. He always did. The sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the city stretching beneath him like a map he owned. He showered, dressed, checked his phone, There were a few notifications, mentions, tags, but he ignored them. People were always talking, especially after a good night at the restaurant. He arrived at work just before noon, nodding at staff, already planning his day. A tasting with a new supplier, a meeting with investors, another charity gala coming up next week. Everything was moving exactly as it should. Then his assistant appeared at his office door, pale. "Julian," she said carefully, "we have a problem." He frowned. "You always say that. What is it?" She held up her phone. It's about last night." Julian waved a dismissive hand. "If this is about that girl, don't waste my time. She shouldn't have been here in the first place." His assistant swallowed. "There's a video." Julian paused. "A video of what?" She turned the phone toward him. He watched himself on the screen, his own voice echoing back at him, louder and uglier than he remembered. The laughter, the bread, the way the girl's hand shook when she took it. The caption scrolled beneath the clip in bold white letters. "Rich restaurant owner humiliates hungry teenager." Julian's jaw tightened. So it's everywhere," she said. "Millions of views. People are angry." "That'll pass," he snapped. "It always does." But it didn't. Within hours, sponsors began calling. Investors asked questions. Reporters showed up uninvited. Cameras waiting outside the restaurant doors. Staff whispered in corners. Reservations were canceled. A charity quietly removed his name from an upcoming event. Julian felt something unfamiliar creeping up his spine. Unease. Across the city, Nia sat in a quiet office with a man who didn't smile easily. He was older, silver-haired, his suit understated but expensive. A lawyer, one of the best. He flipped through the documents she'd brought with a growing look of interest. "This is substantial," he said finally. "You understand what this means?" Nia nodded. "I do." He studied her. "And you're sure you want to proceed?" She thought of the laughter, the bread. Malik sleeping hungry on the couch. "Yes," she said, "I'm sure." As she stood to leave, her phone buzzed with a notification. Another clip, another angle, another wave of outrage. Nia looked at the screen, then locked it and slipped it into her pocket. Julian Cross thought yesterday had been the worst day of her life. He had no idea it was only the beginning. By the third day, Julian Cross could no longer pretend everything was under control. The confidence he'd worn like armor for years had begun to crack, and beneath it was something raw and frantic that he didn't recognize in himself. His phone rang constantly now, not with praise or invitations, but with sharp, clipped voices, demanding explanations. Investors wanted distance. Partners wanted assurances he couldn't give. His publicist spoke in urgent whispers about narrative control and temporary stepping back, phrases that tasted like defeat. Julian stood in his office, staring out through the glass wall at the dining room below. Tables that were once booked weeks in advance now sat empty, white linens untouched, silverware gleaming under lights that felt too bright for the silence they illuminated. A handful of staff moved about quietly, their eyes avoiding his. He could feel it, the shift. Respect turning into resentment, fear turning into judgment. He slammed his palm against the glass, the sound sharp and sudden. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself. "One stupid video." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. The clip had struck a nerve, and he knew it. People weren't just angry about what he'd said, they were angry about what it represented. The imbalance, the ease with which he'd reduced someone else's pain to entertainment. For the first time in his life, Julian felt exposed. Across town, Nia sat in a small conference room with her lawyer, Marcus Levin, and two associates. The space smelled faintly of coffee and paper, the walls lined with framed degrees and newspaper clippings. She listened intently as Marcus spoke, his tone calm but edged with excitement. "We've filed the initial paperwork," he said, quietly. "No press yet. We don't want to tip him off too early." Nia nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She'd barely slept again, but she didn't feel tired. If anything, she felt sharper than ever, like her mind had finally locked into place. "What about the records?" she asked. "The transfers?" "We're tracing them," Marcus replied. "There are gaps, things that don't add up, which is good for us." Nia exhaled slowly. She thought of her mother, of the way she used to sit at the kitchen table with stacks of papers, explaining budgets and investments like they were stories instead of numbers. Nia had listened back then without realizing she was learning, without realizing she'd need this knowledge one day. "Will he fight it?" Nia asked. Marcus smiled faintly. "People like Julian Cross always do, especially when they think they're untouchable." Nia's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen. Another article, another headline. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The noise was growing louder without her help. That evening, Julian attended a crisis meeting with his inner circle. They sat around a long table in a private dining room, the air tense, plates of untouched food between them. His publicist spoke first, outlining damage control strategies, apologies, donations, a carefully staged visit to a shelter. Julian listened, jaw tight, fingers drumming impatiently. "I'm not groveling," he snapped. "I didn't break any laws." His lawyer cleared his throat. "Actually, Julian, that's not entirely certain." Julian's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "There are some old agreements," the lawyer said cautiously, "from before the restaurant opened. Silent partnership documents. They've resurfaced." Julian felt his stomach drop. "Resurfaced? How?" "They've been submitted as part of a preliminary claim." The room seemed to tilt. "By who?" Julian demanded, though some part of him already knew. The lawyer hesitated. "A young woman, Nia." "Don't say her name," Julian barked, standing so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "That girl has nothing. She can't touch me." But even as he spoke, fear clawed at his chest. He remembered Alana now, the sharpness in her eyes, the way she'd insisted on everything being in writing. He thought he was smarter, thought time would erase her. He was wrong. That night, Julian didn't go home. He sat alone in his office, the city lights flickering beyond the windows. Replaying the past in his mind, he poured himself a drink he didn't taste. His phone lay face down on the desk, buzzing occasionally with messages he didn't want to read. For the first time in years, silence felt oppressive instead of peaceful. Nia, meanwhile, sat on the fire escape outside her apartment, the cool night air brushing against her face. Malik was asleep inside, his homework finished, his stomach full, thanks to a neighbor who'd brought over leftovers without asking questions. Nia stared up at the sky, thinking of the path unfolding in front of her. She wasn't naive. She knew this wouldn't be easy. She knew Julian would fight, that his resources dwarfed hers in almost every way. But she also knew something else now, something he didn't. He'd built his empire on the assumption that no one would ever challenge him. The next morning, the papers were served. Julian was in the middle of a call when his assistant knocked, her face tight with tension. "They're here," she said. "Who?" he snapped. "Process servers." The envelope felt heavier than it should have when Julian took it. He tore it open, scanning the first page, then the second. Legal language blurred together, but the meaning was unmistakable. Ownership claims, fraud allegations, an injunction. Julian's breath came shallow. He looked up at his assistant, then past her, as if expecting someone to laugh and tell him this was all a joke. "This is extortion," he said weakly. "She's bluffing." But the documents didn't bluff. They cited dates, amounts, signatures. Julian sank into his chair, the room spinning slightly. For the first time since he'd started Belmont, since he'd convinced himself he'd earned everything he had, he felt truly cornered. And somewhere across the city, Nia stepped into a different building entirely, one with marble floors and mirrored walls. She wore a borrowed blazer that fit her better than she expected. Her posture was straight, her expression calm. As the elevator doors closed behind her, she caught her reflection in the glass. For a moment, she barely recognized herself. The girl Julian had laughed at was still there, somewhere beneath the surface. But she was no longer the one in control. Julian didn't sleep at all that night. He lay on the leather couch in his office, staring at the ceiling as the city hummed outside, every sound sharper than it had ever been before. The documents sat on the desk across from him, untouched, as if ignoring them might make them disappear. He replayed his past over and over, searching for the moment he could have fixed this, the decision that had led him here. But the truth was harder to swallow than he wanted to admit. He hadn't made one fatal mistake. He'd made dozens, and he'd never once believed they would matter. By morning, the pressure had multiplied. News outlets were no longer just talking about the video. They were digging. Old interviews resurfaced. Former employees came forward with stories of intimidation and unpaid overtime. A food supplier quietly severed ties. The charity that once praised him released a carefully worded statement distancing themselves from his personal conduct. Julian scrolled through the headlines with a tightening chest, his sense of control slipping further with every swipe of his thumb. He tried to call his lawyer again. Voicemail. He tried another. And another. When someone finally answered, the voice on the other end was careful, cautious. "Julian, I'm advising all my clients to proceed slowly, right now," the lawyer said. "Public perception is volatile." "So you're abandoning me?" Julian snapped. "I'm advising you," the lawyer replied coolly, then hung up. Julian threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall and shattered, pieces skittering across the polished floor. He stood there, breathing hard, fists clenched, feeling something dangerously close to panic creeping in. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. People like him didn't fall like this. They recovered. They weathered storms. They didn't get dismantled by a girl who couldn't even afford dinner. Across town, Nia sat at the long table in Marcus Levin's office, surrounded by files stacked higher than she was used to seeing anywhere outside a library. The hum of the air conditioner filled the pauses between sentences. As Marcus explained the next steps, she listened closely, asking questions, absorbing every detail. The injunction means he can't make any major financial moves without oversight, Marcus said. No selling assets, no transferring ownership. "And the board?" Nia asked. "They're nervous," Marcus replied, "which means they're listening." Nia nodded. She thought of Julian pacing his glass office, the same space where he'd laughed so easily the night before. The image didn't bring her joy. It brought her focus. This wasn't about revenge in the way people imagined it. It was about correction, about balance. When she left the office, she didn't go home. She walked instead, blending into the flow of the city, her hood pulled up against the chill. She passed the restaurant again without stopping. The windows were dark now, a sign taped to the door announcing a temporary closure. She stood across the street for a moment, watching her reflection ripple across the glass. This place had taken something from her, her dignity, her sense of safety, but it had also given her clarity, and clarity was power. Julian's world continued to shrink over the next 48 hours. His accounts were flagged. His credit cards declined. The board requested an emergency meeting. He arrived late, tie crooked, eyes bloodshot, the weight of exhaustion etched into his face. The room was full of people who once deferred to him. Now, they looked at him like a liability. "We need to talk about the claim," one of them said carefully. "There is no claim," Julian snapped. "It's a lie." Another board member slid a folder across the table. "It's not," she said. "We've reviewed the documents." Julian opened it, his hands trembling despite himself. The signatures were unmistakable. Alana's. His own. He'd forgotten how meticulous she'd been, how she'd insisted on redundancy, on safeguards. "This is ancient history," he said weakly. "She's dead." The room went very quiet. "And her daughter isn't," someone said. Julian felt something inside him give way. That afternoon, he did something he hadn't done in years. He went out alone. No driver, no assistant. He walked through streets he usually passed at a distance, his expensive coat drawing looks he'd never noticed before. People stared. Some whispered. A few recognized him outright, their expressions hardening. By the time he reached the edge of the city, his feet ached and his throat was dry. He stopped outside a small cafe and hesitated before pushing the door open. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and baked bread. The barista glanced up, then froze. "We're closed," she said quickly. Julian nodded, humiliation burning through him. "I just need water," he said. His voice sounded unfamiliar to his own ears. Smaller. She studied him for a long moment, then sighed and handed him a cup. He drank greedily, the cold liquid shocking his system. As he lowered the cup, he caught sight of his reflection in the mirror behind the counter. He barely recognized the man staring back. That night, the email arrived. It was short, precise, a request for a meeting from Nia. Julian stared at the screen, his pulse roaring in his ears. For a moment, anger flared. Then, fear. Then, something colder and more sobering than either. He typed a response, erased it, typed again. Finally, he agreed. The meeting was set for the next morning. Nia arrived early. She sat in the quiet conference room, hands folded, breathing evenly. She wasn't afraid. She'd moved past that. When Julian walked in, he looked smaller than she remembered, his shoulders hunched, his confidence worn thin. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Julian cleared his throat. "I didn't know who you were," he said. Nia met his gaze steadily. "You didn't care." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with everything that had led them here. Julian swallowed, his eyes darting briefly to the door, then back to her. "What do you want?" he asked finally. Nia leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, unwavering. "What was always mine." And as Julian listened, truly listened, for the first time, he began to understand just how deeply he had underestimated her, and how much that mistake was going to cost him. Julian tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. The conference room felt too small, the air too thin, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Nia sat across from him, hands still folded, posture straight, eyes steady. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look angry either. That unsettled him more than anything else could have. He was used to fury, used to desperation. Calm like this meant control. "I can make this go away," Julian said at last. forcing his voice into something resembling confidence. Money, settlements, whatever number you want. Nia tilted her head slightly, as if considering the offer, then shook it once. You already tried to make it go away, she said. You failed. Julian's jaw tightened. You don't understand how this works, he snapped. People like you. He stopped himself, realizing too late how that sounded. Nia didn't react. She simply waited, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until Julian felt compelled to fill it. People without resources, he corrected weakly. They don't win battles like this. Nia leaned back in her chair. My mother did, she said quietly, until you stole from her. The word hit him harder than he expected. Stole. He opened his mouth to argue, to reframe it, to bury it under legal language. But nothing came, because somewhere deep down, he knew it was true. He'd justified it at the time, told himself she'd have wanted him to succeed, told himself she was gone, that the money was better off in his hands. He'd convinced himself that silence equaled consent. Nia stood. The movement was slow, deliberate. This isn't a negotiation, she said. This is notice. She slid a folder across the table. Julian stared at it, dread pooling in his stomach. He didn't want to open it. He already knew what it would contain. Numbers, proof, consequences. When he finally did, his hand shook. The figures were worse than he'd imagined. Interest, damages, control clauses triggered by breach. His breath came shallow, his vision tunneling as he reached the final page. You'll bankrupt me, he said hoarsely. Nia met his eyes. No, she replied. I'll correct you. Julian laughed then, a hollow, broken sound. You think this is justice? Ruining everything I built? You didn't build it alone, Nia said. You just erased the part that didn't fit your story. She gathered her things and headed for the door. Julian stood abruptly, panic flooding through him. Wait, he said. Please. The word tasted bitter, foreign. He'd never had to use it before. Nia paused, but didn't turn around. I'll apologize, Julian said quickly. Publicly. I'll say whatever you want. I'll make donations. I'll fix this. Died. Nia finally looked back at him. Her expression was unreadable. You already showed people who you are, she said. I don't need you to pretend to be better. When she left, the door closing softly behind her, Julian sank back into his chair. The room felt cavernous now, echoing with the weight of what he'd lost in the span of a few days. He stared at the folder until the letters blurred, then closed it with a trembling hand. Outside, Nia breathed deeply, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. The meeting had gone exactly as she expected. Julian was unraveling. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and he felt it. She walked down the steps into the sunlight, her phone buzzing with messages from Marcus and the legal team. Updates, progress, momentum. For the first time in a long while, Nia allowed herself a small smile. That evening, Julian returned to his penthouse, but it no longer felt like home. The space was too quiet, too empty. The expensive art on the walls suddenly meaningless. He poured himself another drink, then another, trying to drown the gnawing sense of dread. But alcohol couldn't silence the truth, pressing in from all sides. The next morning brought another blow. The board voted. Julian was removed as acting CEO pending investigation. The email was polite, clinical, devastating. He stared at it for a long time before deleting it, as if erasing the message could undo the decision. He left the building carrying a single box of personal items. No one stopped him. No one spoke. The elevator ride down felt interminable, each floor a reminder of how far he'd fallen. Across the city, Nia sat at her kitchen table with Malik, helping him with homework. The apartment felt warmer than it had in years. There was food in the fridge, real food. She watched Malik concentrate, his tongue peeking out slightly as he worked through a math problem, and felt something in her chest loosen. "You're smiling," Malik said, glancing up. "Just thinking," Nia replied. That afternoon, the press conference happened without Julian. A statement was released announcing new leadership, an internal review, a commitment to values. Nia watched it on a small TV in Marcus's office, arms crossed, listening as carefully crafted words tried to smooth over the damage. "They'll want you to speak soon," Marcus said. "People are curious." Nia nodded. "Not yet." She wasn't ready. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood something crucial. Timing mattered. Power wasn't just about having the truth. It was about knowing when to reveal it. Julian spent the evening wandering the city again, aimless now, his phone silent for the first time in years. He passed the restaurant without stopping. He couldn't bear to look at it. Instead, his feet carried him somewhere else entirely, somewhere he'd never thought he'd return. The shelter. It was busier tonight, the line stretching down the block. Julian stood at the edge, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, unsure whether to step forward. He recognized a few faces now, people he'd never noticed before, people who noticed him. When it was finally his turn, he approached the counter, heart pounding. He didn't ask for much, just a meal, just a place to sit. And then he saw her. Nia was there again, ladling soup with steady hands, her expression focused. She looked up and their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Julian swallowed hard. "I didn't think you'd be here," he said quietly. Nia regarded him for a long second, then returned to her task. "I go where I'm needed," she replied. She handed him a bowl. Their fingers didn't touch this time. Julian took it carefully, his hands shaking. He sat at a long table, the noise of the shelter washing over him, and ate slowly. For the first time, he wasn't being watched as a spectacle. He was just another man in line. And as he sat there, humbled and exposed, Julian began to realize something he'd never understood before. This wasn't just about a restaurant, or money, or pride. It was about reckoning, and the reckoning wasn't over yet. Julian finished the soup in silence, the warmth spreading through him in a way that felt almost painful. He set the empty bowl aside and sat there longer than necessary, watching the room with eyes that no longer skimmed past faces. He noticed the way people hunched over their meals, protective and grateful at the same time. He noticed the exhaustion etched into their movements, the quiet dignity that persisted even in circumstances he'd once dismissed as personal failure. It was uncomfortable. It was unavoidable. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated near the door. Nia was wiping down the counter now, sleeves rolled up, her movements efficient. He cleared his throat, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether he had the right. She glanced up anyway, her gaze neutral. "I don't expect forgiveness," Julian said. His voice was low, almost lost in the noise of the room. "But I need you to know, I see it now." Nia studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Seeing isn't the same as understanding," she said, "but it's a start." Julian left the shelter with that sentence echoing in his mind. The night air felt colder than before, the city harsher, less forgiving. He walked without direction, his thoughts spiraling. For the first time, he wasn't planning his next move. He didn't know how, Every instinct he'd relied on, dominance, dismissal, confidence, had failed him. What he didn't know was that Nia had been planning for years. The next day, she sat across from a different group of people, this time in a sleek boardroom high above the city. The view was breathtaking, but she barely noticed it. Her focus was on the faces around the table: executives, advisors, interim board members. They looked at her with a mix of curiosity and caution. She was young, too young, some of them thought, but none of them underestimated her anymore. Nia spoke calmly, laying out her vision with clarity that surprised even Marcus. She talked about restructuring, about transparency, about reinvesting profits into the community that had sustained the restaurant long before it was fashionable to acknowledge them. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture. She simply stated facts and intentions, one after another, until resistance softened into consideration. By the end of the meeting, the tone had shifted. "We didn't expect this," one board member admitted, "but it's compelling." Nia nodded. "It's necessary." Outside the boardroom, Marcus exhaled deeply. "You realize what you just did, right?" he said. "You didn't just claim ownership. You set the direction." Nia allowed herself a brief smile. That was always the plan. That afternoon, the press finally got what they'd been waiting for. Nia stood at a podium, cameras flashing, microphones clustered in front of her. She wore a simple blazer, her hair pulled back neatly. Malik watched from the back of the room, wide-eyed, pride radiating from him. "I'm not here to shame anyone," Nia began, her voice steady. "I'm here to tell the truth." She spoke about her mother, not as a victim, but as a visionary. She spoke about partnerships and accountability. She spoke about dignity, not as a buzzword, but as a baseline. She didn't mention the bread. She didn't mention the laughter. She didn't have to. The world already knew. Julian watched the broadcast from a small, dim apartment he'd rented under a short-term lease. The penthouse was gone now, sold to cover mounting legal costs. He sat on a folding chair, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the screen. Every word landed like a weight, not because it was cruel, but because it was precise. When the press conference ended, Julian turned off the TV and sat in silence. The realization settled fully then. Nia hadn't acted out of impulse. This wasn't a sudden reversal of fortune. It was a long game, set in motion years ago by a woman he'd dismissed and continued by a daughter he'd humiliated. He thought back to that night in the restaurant, the way he'd laughed, the ease of it, the carelessness. He understood now that the moment hadn't been spontaneous. It had been a test, and he'd failed it completely. Weeks passed. The restaurant reopened under new leadership. Changes were immediate and visible. Wages increased. Policies shifted. Community nights were introduced quietly, without fanfare. The press took note, cautiously optimistic. Julian tried to stay out of the spotlight. He found temporary work consulting for a small firm that didn't care about his past, only his expertise. The pay was modest. The hours were long. For the first time in his life, he was just another name on a schedule. One evening, as he walked home, he passed the restaurant again. The lights were warm now, inviting in a way they hadn't been before. He stopped across the street, watching people enter: families, couples, individuals who looked like they belonged because someone had decided they did. He didn't go inside. Across the city, Nia sat with Malik on the fire escape, the same place she'd once sat alone, hungry and furious. The sky was clear tonight, the stars faint but visible. "You did it," Malik said softly. Nia smiled. "We did," She thought of her mother then, of the lessons she'd left behind, without realizing how powerful they would become. She thought of the bread, the laughter, the way the world had tried to tell her who she was allowed to be. She'd answered in the only way that mattered, not with noise, not with rage, but with ownership. And somewhere deep in the city, a man who once believed he was untouchable learned what it truly meant to beg not for mercy, but for meaning. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, quiet, methodical, unavoidable. Julian learned this on a Tuesday morning when his interim supervisor called him into a cramped office with beige walls and flickering fluorescent lights. It was nothing like the glass-walled boardrooms he used to command. No view, no assistants hovering, just 2 chairs and a desk scarred by years of use. "We're restructuring," the supervisor said, eyes never quite meeting Julian's. "Your contract won't be renewed." Julian nodded slowly. He'd known this moment was coming. Still, something hollowed out in his chest as the words settled. He gathered his things, 2 notebooks, a pen, a cheap tablet, and walked out without argument. There was no leverage left to use, no intimidation to deploy. The world no longer bent around him. Outside, the sky hung low and gray. He stood there for a long time, unsure where to go next, until the city's rhythm nudged him forward, 1 step, then another. Across town, Nia was dealing with a different kind of pressure. Success, she was learning, came with its own weight. Emails poured in daily: investors, activists, critics, opportunists. Some praised her as a symbol, others accused her of exploiting outrage. A few warned her not to forget her place, though they disguised it with corporate language and thin smiles. She read everything, responded to little. What mattered most to her was the work itself. She spent hours walking through the restaurant kitchens, listening to staff, learning names, understanding routines. She visited suppliers personally, renegotiating contracts, not just for profit, but for sustainability. She sat in on training sessions, not to supervise, but to observe. One evening, long after closing, she found herself alone in the dining area. The tables were clean, the lights dimmed. She sat where she'd once stood, humiliated, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. For the first time since everything had exploded, she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not triumph, grief. Grief for the years her mother had worked herself thin, believing in promises that were never honored. Grief for the girl she'd been, swallowing hunger and shame in equal measure. Grief for the version of the world that could have existed if decency had come sooner. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from Marcus. He wants to meet again. Nia stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "Why?" "Closure," Marcus wrote. On his end. Nia exhaled slowly. She wasn't obligated to give him that. But she understood something now that she hadn't before. Closure wasn't a gift. It was a mirror. "Set it up," she replied. "Public place." They met at a small park near the river. No cameras, no lawyers. Just 2 people sitting on opposite ends of a weathered bench as autumn leaves skittered across the pavement. Julian looked different again, thinner, quieter. His clothes were clean but worn, his posture less rigid, as if he'd learned that standing tall no longer guaranteed anything. "Thank you for coming," he said. Nia nodded. "You said you needed to talk." Julian stared at the water, its surface broken by ripples and reflected light. "I spent my whole life thinking power was something you took," he said. "Something you proved by making other people small." Nia didn't interrupt. "I didn't lose everything because of a video," he continued. I lost it because I was empty long before that. I just hid it better. He turned to her then, eyes searching, uncertain. I don't expect forgiveness, he said again, but I needed you to know, I understand now that what I did wasn't just cruel. It was revealing. Nia considered him carefully. She saw no manipulation in his expression, no desperation either. Just a man standing in the aftermath of his own choices. Understanding doesn't change the past, she said, but it does change what you do next. Julian nodded. I'm volunteering now, he said quietly. At the shelter, not the one you work with. Another. I needed to do it somewhere I wasn't known. Nia absorbed this without reaction. And it doesn't make me a good person, Julian added quickly. I know that. It doesn't erase anything, but it's honest. She studied the river again, then stood. That's all anyone can ask for, she said. Honesty. Julian rose as well, hesitating. Will you ever? He trailed off, shaking his head. Never mind. Nia met his gaze one last time. I don't need you to be anything to me, she said. I already got back what was taken. She walked away then, her steps steady, unhurried. Months later, the story everyone thought they knew had faded from headlines, replaced by newer scandals, louder outrage. But something quieter had taken its place. The restaurant became a case study in business schools, not for its controversy, but for its transformation. Articles were written about ethical restructuring, about leadership rooted in accountability. Nia declined interviews more often than she accepted them. When she did speak, she redirected attention to her team, to her mother's legacy, to the idea that dignity should never be negotiable. Malik enrolled in culinary school, working evenings at the restaurant, his confidence growing with every dish he mastered. Sometimes he'd catch Nia watching him with a soft smile, pride glowing just beneath the surface. And Julian? Julian learned how to live smaller. He learned how to listen without waiting to speak, how to take instruction without resentment, how to sit with discomfort instead of bulldozing through it. Some days were harder than others. Some nights, regret pressed down on him so heavily he could barely breathe, but he didn't run from it anymore. On the anniversary of the night that had changed everything, Nia returned to the shelter after closing. She brought fresh bread, still warm, the smell filling the room. She set it on the counter and stepped back as people gathered, grateful, human, whole. As she watched them eat, she felt something settle inside her at last. Not victory, not revenge, but peace. Because the world hadn't changed overnight. It had changed one moment at a time when someone chose not to laugh, not to turn away, not to pretend they didn't see. And this time, the story ended not with someone begging on their knees, but with something far more lasting: balance. Years later, when people talked about that story, they always got one detail wrong. They said it ended in the restaurant. They said it ended with Julian losing everything. They said it ended when Nia won. But the truth was quieter and heavier than that. The real ending didn't happen in a boardroom or on a news feed. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a place no one would ever film. Nia was visiting a public high school on the edge of the city, one of those buildings that carried decades of chipped paint and stubborn hope in equal measure. She'd been invited to speak to a small group of students about entrepreneurship. Not success, not money, just ownership of ideas, of choices, of self. She stood at the front of the classroom, looking out at faces that reminded her too much of herself. Tired eyes, guarded expressions, kids who'd learned early not to expect anything to work out in their favor. She spoke without notes. She talked about her mother, about contracts she hadn't understood, yet still trusted, about nights when dinner was whatever could be stretched the farthest, about how humiliation didn't always arrive screaming, sometimes it arrived laughing. The room was silent. Then a hand went up, a girl in the back, thin, shoulders drawn inward, voice barely steady enough to carry. "How did you know when to stop being angry?" Nia paused. She thought of the bread. She thought of the laugh. She thought of Julian's face when he finally realized the cost of a moment he'd never thought twice about. "I didn't," Nia said honestly. "I just stopped letting anger drive." The bell rang not long after. Students filed out slowly, some lingering to say thank you, others just nodding, their thoughts clearly somewhere deeper than the classroom. As Nia gathered her things, the teacher approached her. "There's someone who asked if they could speak with you," she said quietly. They didn't give a name. Nia followed her into the hallway. At the far end, near a row of lockers dented by time and use, stood a man holding a paper bag. He looked older now, not just in years, but in bearing, like someone who had finally stopped pretending to be untouchable. Julian. He didn't step closer. He didn't smile. He just waited, as if acknowledging that he no longer had the right to demand space in her life. "I didn't know you'd be here," Nia said. "I know," Julian replied. "I didn't come for that." He held out the bag, hands steady. "I volunteer with a mentorship program now," he said. "Career skills, financial literacy, mostly for kids who don't think any of it is meant for them." Nia didn't take the bag yet. "There's a student here," Julian continued, eyes briefly flicking toward the classroom door. "Her mother works 2 jobs. She skips lunch so her little brother can eat. She reminds me of someone." Nia felt her throat tighten. "In the bag," Julian said, "is a scholarship check. Anonymous. Enough to get her through her first year of whatever she chooses." Silence stretched between them. "This isn't absolution," Julian added quickly. "I know that, and I'm not asking you to see me differently. I just wanted you to know that one moment can ruin a life, but it can also redirect one." Nia finally took the bag. Their fingers didn't touch. "I didn't come to thank you," Julian said, voice low. "I came to make sure the lesson didn't stop with me." He nodded once, a small, respectful gesture, then turned and walked away down the hallway, past lockers covered in stickers and faded dreams, past a future he would never fully belong to, but no longer needed to control. Nia stood there long after he was gone. That evening, she sat alone on her fire escape again, the city glowing below. The sounds were the same as years ago, sirens, laughter, distant traffic, but she wasn't. She thought about how easily the world reduced stories like hers into slogans, how desperately people wanted villains and miracles and instant karma. But real life wasn't like that. Real life was a series of choices, some cruel, some brave, most ordinary, that slowly shaped who you became. Julian had laughed once. She had remembered. And instead of breaking the cycle with cruelty, she had broken it with patience, precision, and resolve. The hungry girl didn't become powerful enough to humiliate a man. She became powerful, so no one else would ever have to beg for dignity at a table again. And that was the part of the story that never went viral, but lasted the longest. The weeks that followed were quieter than anyone expected, but in their quietness, they were louder than anything Julian or anyone else had experienced. Life at the restaurant had settled into a rhythm that felt intentional, deliberate, and sustainable. Nia moved through it like a conductor, not dictating, but guiding. She knew each employee by name, their strengths, their fears, their ambitions. She didn't simply manage, she cultivated. And slowly, quietly, the restaurant became more than a place to eat. It became a symbol, a living tribute to her mother's vision and her own perseverance. Julian, on the other hand, became a ghost of his former self, but in a way that changed him for the better. No more boardroom domination, no more public adulation, no more easy laughter at the expense of others. His pride had been dismantled, piece by piece. And what replaced it wasn't empty shame, it was awareness. He volunteered every day now, teaching financial literacy, mentoring youth, and facing the world without the armor of entitlement he had once worn. Each day reminded him of the consequences of carelessness, arrogance, and cruelty. But Nia's work wasn't just about Julian. It was about proving that a single life, no matter how small or overlooked, could command influence without cruelty. She held scholarship programs, mentorship sessions, and free culinary workshops. She created a foundation for children whose stories echoed her own. She remembered the moments of humiliation and hunger, not as wounds, but as lessons, carefully folded into every decision she made. The restaurant became a landmark of change. Local media ran feature stories about how a young woman had taken control of a major enterprise and rebuilt it on integrity, sustainability, and care. Schools invited her to speak. Communities sought her guidance. And everywhere she went, Nia carried the quiet confidence of someone who had lived through the worst, understood it, and refused to let it define her or others. One evening, months after the last confrontation, she returned to the shelter where Julian had first handed her a bowl of soup that now felt like a lifetime ago. Malik walked beside her, holding her hand, sharing laughter they hadn't allowed themselves to share in years. They entered quietly, but the regulars recognized her immediately. Faces lit up. People whispered her name, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the depth of what she had built. Not just a restaurant, not just a business, but a community. Julian arrived shortly after, though not to seek attention. He was delivering supplies for the mentoring program he had founded. When he saw Nia, their eyes met. There was no anger, no tension, no lingering resentment. Only understanding, only acknowledgement. He had humbled himself, but not in submission. He had humbled himself in recognition of what it meant to live a life of responsibility. "You've done more than I ever imagined," Julian said quietly. Nia shook her head. "I didn't do it alone," she replied. "And you're still learning." He smiled faintly, a little embarrassed. "Yeah, I guess I am." The shelter hummed with life around them, children playing, volunteers moving efficiently, meals being served. And in that ordinary chaos, something extraordinary had happened. The balance had been restored, not through vengeance or spectacle, but through deliberate, steady, and patient action. As Nia and Malik walked home that night, the city skyline glimmered like scattered stars, reflecting light in places that had once been dark. She thought of her mother, of the laughter and the bread, of the humiliation, and of Julian's eventual recognition of his own faults. Every step they took felt heavy with history and light with possibility at the same time. The world, Nia realized, didn't need her to exact revenge. It needed her to show what was possible when dignity and resilience outweighed cruelty. And in the quiet moments after the camera stopped flashing, after the articles stopped being written, she finally allowed herself to feel it. Not triumph, not victory, but something deeper, enduring. The knowledge that the story had ended not with humiliation, nor begging, nor spectacle, but with a balance restored and a legacy preserved. And somewhere, far across the city, Julian paused on a street corner, listening to the laughter of children in the distance. He remembered the girl he had once mocked and the woman she had become. And he knew in that moment that some lessons could only be learned through humility, patience, and the quiet unfolding of justice. The story that had begun with ridicule, hunger, and pain had ended in understanding, restoration, and enduring strength. And though the world would continue to seek drama, sensationalism, and clickbait, the truth remained. Some stories are about more than spectacle. They are about the quiet power of resilience, the patience of timing, and the lasting impact of dignity reclaimed. The city moved on, headlines changed, life went forward. But for Nia, Malik, and even Julian, the lessons of those nights and the transformation that followed would never fade. And in that enduring truth, the story found its real, lasting ending.